You don't explode when you're upset. You disappear. In a culture that respects fast reactions and loud certainty, your silence feels like a flaw. People interpret it quickly. They call it avoidance. They call it immaturity. They call it passive aggression. But none of those labels capture what is actually happening inside you. Because when you go silent, it isn't emptiness, it's overload. Your mind does not shut down in conflict. It speeds up. You replay the conversation in microscopic detail. You examine tone shifts. You dissect word choice. You analyze whether their reaction was proportional. You question whether yours would be. You imagine 5 possible outcomes depending on what you say next. While the room experiences a pause, your internal world becomes intensely active. You go silent not because you lack emotion, but because your emotional and cognitive systems activate at the same time. And that simultaneity creates paralysis. You value control. You believe in measured responses. You don't want to escalate something unnecessarily. You don't want to become the person who reacts impulsively and regrets it later. So you hold it in. You tell yourself you're being mature, and sometimes you are. But there is a difference between intentional restraint and identity-level self-silencing. The difference is subtle. From the outside, they look identical. Internally, they feel very different. To understand this, we have to move beyond behavior and examine identity formation. People who go silent when upset often built that silence early. It was adaptive. Maybe expressing anger led to dismissal. Maybe strong emotion triggered criticism. Maybe vulnerability was met with logic instead of empathy. So your nervous system learned something important. Expression equals risk. Silence equals safety. Over time, that calculation became automatic. You began thinking before speaking, then thinking about thinking before speaking. This is metacognition. You don't just feel upset. You evaluate whether your upset is valid. You don't just experience hurt. You question whether you are overreacting. You don't just feel anger. You compare it to how others might respond in your position. This internal evaluation slows you down. In moments that require quick emotional exchange, you are still assessing the legitimacy of your own experience. While others react outwardly, you react inwardly. That inward reaction creates a split. One part of you feels intensely. Another part monitors and edits those feelings. Over time, the monitoring system grows stronger. It becomes your identity. You begin to see yourself as composed, controlled, rational. But the cost of constant self-monitoring is emotional congestion. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear. They accumulate. There is also cognitive complexity at play. You rarely see conflict in black and white. When someone hurts you, you instinctively analyze their background, their stress levels, their personality patterns. You see context. You see nuance. You see the full psychological landscape. That makes pure anger difficult. Anger requires simplification. It requires a clear villain. But your mind resists that simplicity. So, instead of reacting, you hold competing perspectives simultaneously. Holding multiple truths at once is intellectually sophisticated. Emotionally, it is exhausting. This is where overstimulation enters. When you are upset, your system does not isolate the current event. It activates related memories. It connects themes. It recalls previous arguments that felt similar. The present moment becomes layered with history. Your nervous system reads it as larger than it appears. The intensity increases. And when intensity exceeds processing capacity, the body defaults to shutdown or withdrawal. Silence becomes regulation. But the outside world does not interpret it that way. In relationships, your quiet can feel like abandonment. In friendships, it can feel like indifference. In the workplace, it can be perceived as disengagement or lack of confidence. The gap between your internal experience and others' external interpretation creates relational friction. And that friction reinforces your original fear. Expression leads to misunderstanding, so you double down on silence. There is also a belonging tension here. Many of you already feel different. You think deeply. You overanalyze social interactions. You notice micro-expressions. You anticipate outcomes before they occur. This depth can make casual emotional expression feel chaotic. When someone reacts loudly, you feel overwhelmed rather than empowered. Your silence becomes a way to preserve psychological coherence. But belonging often requires visible emotion. People bond through shared expression. When you retreat instead of reacting, others may struggle to locate you emotionally. You might then feel misunderstood, which deepens isolation. You begin to oscillate between two identities, the composed observer and the internally overwhelmed thinker. Neither feels fully seen. In romantic relationships, this dynamic becomes especially intense. When conflict arises, your partner may want immediate reassurance or dialogue. You, however, need time to process. You want to understand your feelings before articulating them. But your need for processing time can be interpreted as emotional withdrawal. The more pressured you feel to respond quickly, the more your system shuts down. It is not indifference. It is cognitive overload under relational urgency. At work, the same pattern appears differently. You might stay quiet in meetings when frustrated, preferring to refine your thoughts privately. Others may interpret your silence as agreement or lack of ideas. Later, you replay the moment and wish you had spoken. This reinforces a narrative of missed opportunities. Over time, self-silencing can impact career trajectory, not because you lack insight, but because your insight remains internal. The hidden cost of this pattern is loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness. Functional loneliness. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Because the most intense parts of your emotional world remain unspoken. You carry them alone. You pride yourself on independence. But beneath that independence is hyper-responsibility. You believe it is your job to regulate yourself so others do not have to deal with your intensity. That belief feels mature. It is also heavy. There is another layer few people talk about. When you consistently silence your immediate emotional reactions, you begin to doubt them. You lose trust in your first instincts. You rely on analysis instead of intuition. Over time, this creates self-concept fragmentation. Part of you feels. Another part critiques. A third part suppresses. Instead of a unified internal voice, you experience internal debate. That fragmentation can look like calm on the outside and confusion on the inside. So is your silence avoidance? Sometimes. If silence becomes a way to escape necessary conversations indefinitely, it can reinforce anxiety. But more often, it is an attempt at precision. It is an attempt to prevent damage. It is self-control rooted in fear of misrepresentation. It is depth without a safe outlet. The key distinction is intention and duration. Healthy self-control involves temporary pause, followed by eventual articulation. Identity-based silence involves indefinite containment. One regulates emotion. The other erases it. Integration does not mean becoming reactive. It does not mean abandoning thoughtfulness. It means shortening the distance between feeling and expression. It means allowing imperfect articulation instead of waiting for perfect clarity. It means saying, I need a moment to process, but this matters to me, instead of disappearing entirely. This small shift preserves both self-control and connection. It also requires rebuilding trust with your own emotions. Instead of interrogating every feeling for legitimacy, you practice acknowledging it first. You can still analyze later. Emotional granularity helps here. Instead of labeling everything as anger or frustration, you differentiate. Is it disappointment? Is it feeling dismissed? Is it fear of being misunderstood? Specificity reduces overwhelm. When emotions are named precisely, they feel less chaotic and more communicable. There is strength in restraint. There is also strength in visibility. The goal is not to suppress one for the other. It is to align them. Your silence developed for a reason. It protected you. It preserved relationships that might have fractured under impulsivity. But protection strategies that remain unexamined can become prisons. The deeper question is not whether you are avoidant. It is whether your silence still serves you in the environments you inhabit now. When you go silent next time, notice what is happening beneath it. Because silence is powerful. It can communicate wisdom, boundaries, and absence. The difference lies in whether it is chosen consciously or driven automatically by old fear. When you understand that, it is no longer, why do I go silent? It becomes, what am I protecting when I do? And once you can answer that honestly, your silence stops being a mystery and becomes a signal of a nervous system that learned to survive through restraint and is now learning, slowly, how to stay present without disappearing.